2.
And we're back. I'm your host, BKP. Good morning from the office, North Georgia's only live online morning show. Our guest now is Republican candidate for Georgia's Secretary of State, Josh Mckoon. Mr. Mckoon, how are you this morning?
I'm doing great, Brian. Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, you're running a statewide race, so you're all over the state. Can we ask where you're at this morning? I know it's every day you're somewhere new and speaking to a different audience. Can I ask you where you're at today, where you're campaigning?
So I'm in the Atlanta area today. We're actually doing some filming for some commercials most of the day today, and then I will have a campaign fundraising kickoff tonight at Five Seasons in Sandy Springs there at the Prado from 6 to 8. So it's a full day.
Let me ask you, there was a forum last night, and let's get right into this. Let's get this subject immediately. There was a forum last night, and I read an article, and there seems to be, every time the Secretary of State candidates get together or you have an interview, the continuing question of elections and safeguarding elections. I want to know two things. One, as Secretary of State, what kind of voting machine, or how would you want it to be that the voting machine, how would you want the citizens of Georgia to vote? Paper ballot, machine? What does your Secretary of State office look like as far as voting?
Well, my guidelines on this are really, there are two things. Number one, we need the process to select the new machines to be an open, competitively bid process that is totally transparent. And we ought to have whatever that technology is, needs to have a paper trail which can be audited and independently verified. Now, having said that, I think where we really need to have some input is from local elections officials who actually conduct the elections. I think they need to be very involved in driving the process of what specific solution do we pick. But in terms of a general guideline, I think whatever we have, we've got to have that paper audit trail that can be independently audited and verified. All
right, well, that's something I want to clear up with the audience is we hear paper ballot, but we're not talking about a paper ballot. You're saying paper trail, meaning we would still have a computer system that we would vote on or a screen type that we would vote on. Are you advocating what I hear is like the receipt of your vote? When you say paper trail, what exactly are you saying?
So there are several different systems. I'll tell you one that that I think is a good one, and that is one that has a touchscreen interface. When you are finished voting, it actually does print out a physical ballot that you are then able to visually inspect and confirm your choices before you turn it into an optical scanner and then drops down into a ballot box. So we have the electronic record of your vote, but we also have a physical ballot. And in the case of a close election, take the city of Atlanta's mayor's race in December, 700 vote margin. You can't really do a recount with our current technology because we don't have physical ballots. We can just run those machines again and see if the counts match up. This way we can do a manual hand recount in close elections. So that's the sort of solution that I'm thinking about.
Well, we continue to hear that, and I know you continue to answer that question on a daily basis everywhere you go. So let's switch gears. What would you want to put in place? And I understand the paper ballot. As far as to safeguard, what would you like to see to safeguard, and I understand most of this is legislation that would be necessary, to safeguard the vote, to stop the illegal voting. Now, I'm going to say that in the affirmative because I always believe there's no such thing as a statewide election that doesn't have some sort in one way or another. But to pinpoint illegals, false identification, voting twice, whatever it may be, what would your Secretary of State office want to put in place to safeguard the actual vote once it's cast in Georgia, and who is actually casting that vote?
Sure. So, and let me say real quick, you did mention the 6th District Congressional Republican Party Forum. I want to thank them for putting that on, and I'm very grateful for the result we got in the straw poll. Over 54% of those that attended voted for me in the straw poll. Another clear indication of the momentum we're having. What I would say to you on illegal voting, a couple different things. We got to really tighten up absentee voting. We had a situation in Columbus 4 years ago. A lady shows up at the elections office with 19 absentee ballots. She's asked why she has them. She says, I'm doing this as a service to a local nursing home where I work. They did an investigation. They found 15 of those 19 residents were not well enough to sign their name or make their mark, but someone had filled out those applications and turned them in and voted those ballots. Now, the problem with that story, because people on the left will say, well, those votes weren't counted. The problem is no one was prosecuted and no one went to jail. And as the Secretary of State, I'm going to make sure we have a relationship with our district attorneys and our solicitors that when those kinds of cases come to our attention, people know there's going to be a consequence. That's really important. Right now, there's no penalty for cheating, so you can expect cheating to occur. The second thing we've got to do is clear up this issue about the 48,000 driver's license and identity cards that have been issued to illegal aliens in our state. If they're going to have those, we at least need them to be plainly distinguishable from the regular driver's license. On day one as Secretary of State, I'm going to look at that limited term driver's license database that includes the driver's licenses that have been issued to these illegal aliens. I'm going to go to all 159 counties, and we're going to look at the voting list. We're going to make sure we purge anyone from that list that is not a citizen and should not be entitled to a vote. Third and finally, we've got to clean up the people who remain on our rolls after they are deceased or after they have moved out of state. It is very, very important for us to be routinely doing that. There is no statewide process for that. In my home county, the Board of Elections literally takes out the newspaper obituaries to try to figure out who needs to be taken off the rolls. There's no reason for that. We ought to be cooperating with the Social Security Administration to look at their death records and make sure that list is being cleaned up on a routine basis. That takes away the ability for fraud.
Could the Social Security Administration, I know that's federal, but could they not send a notice to you? You know, let me just say this, Mr. Mckoon, while we're talking about this. All too many times here recently in situations we see breakdown between agencies. And could the Social Security Administration not send notice as part of the process to the voter registration? Because they certainly can figure out not to send the next check
exactly
to the deceased person. Now, I mean, I have a friend of mine that got the check for her spouse 2 days before the end of the month, and had to return it because her spouse died before the end of the month. That's how they do that. Am I wrong?
No, you're not. You're zeroing in on exactly what I believe the solution is, which is we know there's a government agency that tracks very closely when people are passing away, and we ought to take advantage of that to be able to clean up our rolls. And we also need to make sure we're doing it when people move from state to state. We have people. We live in a society. People are very mobile, and so if we've got people registered in multiple states, we need to make sure that they're only registered in the state where they're currently residing. So those are two things. If we do that, we tighten up our absentee ballot process. We can do an awful lot to eliminate opportunities to cheat. And the last thing I'll say to you on this is we do not have enough sworn law enforcement officers in the Secretary of State's office handling investigations of voter registration fraud and voter fraud. And so we need to hire a few more folks. I tell people all the time, we wouldn't say we solved the speeding problem if we reduced our number of state troopers to 2, which is the situation we have right now. We have 2 investigators full-time covering 159 counties. That's unacceptable. But there is a voter fraud problem, and it needs to be resolved.
Well, let me say this also. When you say state to state, I think it clears up what the priority is in this country sometimes, and the priority of making sure that our vote is, they're more concerned with foreign interference in our vote. But years ago, several years ago, there was a national database put in for driver's license, which did not affect state DMV. You still have a Georgia driver's license, North Carolina and Alabama. They still have their state DMV, but there's a shared database to where you don't run over to Alabama and get a driver's license because you're holding a current one in Georgia.
Right.
Is this too much to ask to have some sort of database on voting? Is it not that critical that maybe something like that nationally, a national database? And I hate to say database because everybody gets all nervous. Don't take me wrong, and I'm not trying. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do understand what you're saying. I frankly don't think a national database is necessary. I think that what we need is interstate cooperation between Secretary of State's offices. I think if we had an agreement in place with all of the states that border Georgia, just to be routinely sharing that information, that we could solve most of this problem. We had a state elections board meeting last week where there were 6 people who had voted in North Carolina and Georgia in the 2014 election. So this is going on. It's not just a question of people being registered in multiple states. People are actually voting in the same election cycle in multiple states. So we've got to deal with it.
Well, I want to back up just a little bit on the phrase national database, because I know that can be a touchy phrase. So I'm not advocating, but you understand what I was trying to say. Just some kind of notification system that, hey, you're registered already in another state. Or when you go to register, to see if you're registered at another state or address. Moving right along there, you said something to distinguish, clear distinguish the difference in types of driver's license. Now, there was a bill this past year that did not make it through, correct? That would have had a resident a different kind of look on the driver's license, so the individual at the election booth would be able to see an immediate difference in distinguishing a resident versus somebody that's legally here to vote. Is that correct?
That's right. I actually had a bill in the Senate that would have required that these licenses say non-citizen and that they also say not for federal identification. So that they couldn't be used for purposes basically other than driving. And unfortunately, we couldn't get it through. I can tell you 2 things. If I'm the next Secretary of State, number one, we're going to do what I described earlier, taking that limited term database and using it to go through the list and make sure we purge anyone who's not a citizen. But secondly, what we're going to do is, as part of our legislative package, we're going to come back again on this very important issue to distinguish what kind of driver's license people are issuing. Because I've talked to poll workers all over the state, and I've said, do you know what it means if you get presented with a driver's license that says limited term at the top? Do you know that's a red flag and that you need to ask questions? And the answer universally has been no. I did not know about that, didn't realize that was there. And frankly, even if you were looking for it, you might miss it because it is almost identical to the driver's license you and I have. That is crazy, and we need to fix it. So I'm sorry it didn't happen this year, but it's something we're not giving up on, and I certainly would intend on making it part of my legislative package next year.
Well, I want to be clear because I live in rural Georgia, and you have visited our area several times, and we have voter polls that might have 300 people registered at that area. And most of the poll workers that come in there, and I don't want to say they don't check ID because they do. You pull it out, they go through everything like they're supposed to. But really, it's a formality pulling the ID out because you're saying first name basis basically to all the poll workers when you go in to vote. But when you get into Atlanta and you get into Macon and Savannah and Columbus, especially around that Atlanta area, these poll workers do not know who's in line. And it's such a rush out the door and all the machines are full of people voting, it's really tough to scrutinize that identification to not keep the line moving. Am I right or wrong?
That's exactly right. I mean, there are a lot of pressures on people on Election Day. We don't need to, this should not be a chore. This should be an easy thing for the poll worker to immediately to jump out at them when they are looking at the license. And other states have figured this out. South Carolina does this already. Their license actually says no lawful status which I think is an even better phrase to use. So other states have figured this out. We ought to be able to figure it out in Georgia and just make it easier on our elections officials, because what's happening right now is when somebody goes and applies for that driver's license, because of the Federal Motor Voter Act, they are being automatically registered to vote unless they opt out.
Right.
And so that's creating a real problem that we need to fix.
Well, let me move on to two things before I get my next guest today, because there's two other things. So we've talked about protecting the integrity of the vote, and obviously you will not be, if elected, Secretary of State through this election cycle. But next election cycle, we feel very strongly that so many challenges to voting, voter registration, we see a mounting legal challenge from the Democrats, an enormous challenge ahead. What does the next Secretary of State, do you think, face in Georgia here with the legal challenges that are coming that office's way?
Well, one of the things I say in every presentation I make is that one of the reasons I'm running for Secretary of State is I'm a lawyer with an election law background. And I think that's vitally important because, as you point out, the Secretary of State's office has been sued, and we can expect it will continue to be sued by out-of-state far-left groups who know they can't change Georgia election law at the State House, so they're trying to change it at the courthouse. And I think the most important part of it is being prepared, being able to anticipate what those legal issues might be, and who better to do that than someone with a legal background with a very good working knowledge of Georgia election law. And that's a big reason I'm running for this office. So if I'm elected, we're going to take a pretty good look at the state election law, the federal election law, look at where we might have problems, try to proactively address them, and be prepared when that litigation does come to us. But it's no longer a sleepy position as it used to be. Ever since the 2000 presidential election and Katherine Harris and the hanging chads and butterfly ballots, the Secretary of State gets sued, and so you need a lawyer in there to manage those processes. Well,
I think somebody cannot overlook the Secretary of State actually certifies elections, and correct?
That's correct.
And you certify the election that actually goes to the electoral college for the state is signed by every Secretary of State in the United States. Am I correct? That's what made Katherine Harris so famous, as she certified that election.
That's exactly right. Okay. That's exactly right.
Let's move on to something else before we leave, because I want to give you an opportunity. Sometimes, Secretary of State, we get so focused on elections and voting machines, we sometimes don't talk about the other things in the office. Like this is where you get certifications, qualifications, licensing. Licensing comes through this office. Tell me about some of the most ridiculous, my words, licensing in the state of Georgia that's coming through the Secretary of State's office that could be eliminated overnight.
Well, two quick examples. Number one, we license librarians in our state. Now, you think about this. Licensing is a permission slip from government to go to work, and we license things because there's a public health or public safety interest. If we stopped licensing librarians tomorrow, there would not be a public health or public safety crisis. The other issue I would bring to your audience's attention has to do with cosmetology license holders. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have cosmetology licenses because they deal with volatile chemicals. They can hurt people. There is a public health interest there. But we require, on average, 350 days of training before someone can get their cosmetology license. And by comparison, an EMT license holder who renders life-saving aid in the event of a medical emergency spends on average 31 days in training. So the idea that it takes 10 times the training to get a license to cut and color hair and do nails as it does to render life-saving aid in the event of a medical emergency just speaks to some of the issues we have in the office. We need to streamline licensing to connect more people to the dignity of honest hard work. Americans for Prosperity has done a nationwide study, found 2.5 million new jobs could be created. say that's 50,000 jobs in Georgia, which is extremely conservative. That's how many jobs we're talking about bringing with Amazon and a $10 billion economic incentive package and all the rest of it. So we can create a lot of jobs just by getting government out of the way and cutting red tape.
The licensing, now let me ask you a question for our viewers. Is that something you will have to get legislation on, or are they certain license requirements that you as Secretary of State can just end with executive order in the office? Is that, or is that these things you're going to have to pull together a list and present to somebody down there under the Gold Dome, hey, I need these changed? How does that work?
It's a mix of legislative and administrative issues. You know, if you wanted to get rid of a license entirely, and you would need to repeal the act that involves that. But if you're talking about the number of hours and you're talking about some of the other requirements, a lot of those issues can be handled administratively within the office.
Okay, I don't want to leave without two more things. Number one, and because I got another guest, and I've got a tight timeline. I'm talking to myself, as you know me all too well, Mr. Mckoon. I know we could get going here. You just finished what may be your last legislative session at this current time. And in that, your last legislative session as a senator, what bills came through that you really liked that passed? Which ones didn't make it all the way through that you were hoping to? How did that session end for you?
Well, I think on the positive side, to me, the best development was that the Senate really led, and I believe your next guest really led on the question of extending a crony capitalist tax break to the commercial aviation industry. And I think that the legislature is to be applauded for resisting the temptation to do that and to stand up and say, you know, we want a tax structure that treats everybody fairly, that treats everybody the same, that doesn't pick winners and losers. So to me, that was probably the best thing that happened during the session. There were several things I was disappointed about. We've talked about the driver's license bill. Obviously, religious freedom remains unfinished business. Both the RFRA bill and the faith-based adoption bill, I believe those bills are going to move forward in the next legislative session. I believe they're going to be signed by the next Republican governor of this state. So I've enjoyed my 8 years in the Senate, but it was definitely time for me to move on, and I'm looking forward to returning to the Capitol next year in a different capacity as the next Secretary of State.
You're an attorney. How important is attorney-client privilege, and how important is it to us to protect this as a nation?
Obviously, attorney-client privilege is incredibly important. It is a cornerstone of the American legal system. The only way you can really have an effective attorney-client relationship is if client communications are privileged. Obviously, I know where you're going with that question, and I, like everyone else, I think was pretty stunned by the news yesterday of the FBI raid on Michael Cohen's offices. This is clearly a developing story. We're going to learn more about it. But I think we all have to be very mindful that attorney-client privilege, again, is a cornerstone of the American legal system. And so we'll have to see how this all plays out. But you know, it's very disturbing, the events of the last 24 hours.
Thank you. We wish you well on the campaign trail. We hope we'll see you soon. If you're in North Georgia, let us know. We'd like to have you in studio or come over and see you. And between now and election, we'd like to get you back on.
Thank you so much, Brian.
I appreciate it. You have a nice day. That's Josh Mckoon. He's Republican. Josh Mckoon is the Republican candidate for Secretary of State of Georgia. We're going to take a brief break right now, and when we return, we'll be on with Republican candidate for Georgia Governor Casey Cagle. Take us a break a minute.